the tea break, we've got a guest with us. Because you'll recall that there's been plenty of coverage about whether cricket will be added to the Olympic Games in 2028. That's certainly the ICC's drive. Well, next year, a form of cricket is one of the sports included in the Westfield Heath British Transplant Games taking place here in Leeds. And the event encourages transplant patients to regain fitness and increase public awareness. And the Games are being held in Leeds next July, having been staged annually since 1978. Alongside me is Dr. Giles Toogood, who's consultant surgeon at St James Hospital. He performed the first ever live liver transplant for the NHS in 2007. Giles, good to see you.
Hi, Alison.
You've also got some cricket background as well. You played at first class level, didn't you, between 78 and 85, and you're an MCC committee member and a trustee at Barnt Green Cricket Club as well, so you come with some good cricketing pedigree, you too. Welcome to the TMS box.
Well, that's very kind of you to have me. Thank you.
And just give me a bit more background on the Transplant Games, first of all, how they came into being.
Yeah, so they've been around for a long time. They first were started by a transplant surgeon called Slapak back in about 78 in Portsmouth, and I've been going annually ever since, all around the country. And I think it's just a great way of getting people who've experienced the same problem and the highs and lows of having a transplant, getting them all together, having a bit of fun. I suspect, well, there are a few who take it very competitively, but the general theme is it's a bit of fun. And, you know, it's Leeds. It was supposed to be Leeds' turn to have it this year, but obviously with everything that's going on, it's been put back to next year.
And I imagine as much about supporting the families of donors as much as those patients and those who are participating as well, is it?
Absolutely. I mean, there are up to about 1,000 athletes who compete, all of whom have had some form of transplant, kidney, liver, heart, lung. And then there are usually between 1,500 and 2,000 spectators. And those spectators are everything from close family and friends to actual donor families. Some of our recipients choose to get in touch with their donors. It's very much up to them. Nothing is given away if the donor family don't want it, but a lot do get in touch. And as a result, they turn up too.
I think that's incredible, isn't it, that donors are in touch with the recipient and vice versa. I mean, and you work in a unit where nearly 400 transplants are performed every year. Is that quite usual, that recipients are in touch with, well, depending on, of course, the nature of the donor, but the families to understand, I guess, where their new lease of life has come from?
Yeah, I don't have the facts and figures of what percentage would get in touch, but my gut feel is that many want to and very much try and do get in touch. Maybe long term, but just to say thank you. Some of them stay anonymous and just receive and give letters and cards, but others actually give each other's email addresses and truly get in touch and then meet.
Remarkable. So what sports are featured at the Games? We've mentioned that a form of cricket is slightly different. Is it an adaptation of the game that will feature?
Well, there's a transplant. Transplant Sport are the charity that sort of have galvanised all this activity, sport, and it's all really to encourage recipients to stay as fit as possible, because the fitter the recipient is, the longer the organ, the transplant they've been donated, they've been given, precious gift, will last as long as possible. And most people, I'm not really answering your question, but most people will then live a pretty normal expected life, to be honest with you. And cricket is one game that is certainly coming into the Games, a bit like we hope the Olympics. But there's everything from track and field, there's football, there's archery, cycling. There's 25 sports. So, and it's held in various sites in Leeds, as it has been with other towns. So you've got the university being used. There's the John Charles Centre, which is where the swimming pool is, and other areas. Golf. So there's one of the golf clubs. We've got lots of nice golf clubs in Leeds, but one of the golf clubs is being used as well.
I mean, and how long would it take somebody who has an organ transplant to get back to the stage of fitness where they feel they can play their sport, whether it's at recreational level or even, have you had instances of patients go on to play higher levels of sport? What's the kind of time frame? I mean, I've had major surgery once, and it was nothing like a transplant, but I just remember how long and slow the recovery was for lung surgery, for example.
Sure. I mean, the bottom line is there's a huge variation, and some people seem to recover extremely quickly, and others do take a bit of time. It depends a lot how ill they are at the time of the transplant. So if they've had a chronic disease for a long period of time, and they are well below par, their nutrition levels are really low, it can take months, and sometimes years. But others can do it in, many of our transplant patients will go home in a few days, literally 3 or 4 days, 5 days. And they can, some of the young people can get back on their feet really quickly. So it's a hugely variable feast, but, I'd say a few months on average.
And do you sense that an event such as the Transplant Games can give a real incentive to a sports-loving patient to regain that fitness, whether it's that discipline to keep up physio and exercising that you need to do in a sort of post-operative type of state? Yeah,
absolutely, Alison. I think, there's so much to sport, isn't there? You've got the team sport element, which encourages us all to work together and to get fit so you don't let your teammates down. And then you've got individual sports which are equally competitive. And it's a challenge, an individual challenge. So, I think sport, across the world is a great way of keeping ourselves healthy in mind and in physically.
And do you find that there are some patients who are quite nervous about getting back to activity after a transplant? Again, I guess it must depend what the organ is exactly, but is there a degree of nervousness about how much I can realistically do after an operation such as that?
Yeah, I think that's true of all surgery, actually. I mean, it's not just transplant surgery I do, and I think a lot of my patients will be nervous about getting back to doing what they normally do. My advice always is, I think the body is the body's a great judge of what you can do, and if you feel like doing something, you should jolly well get on and do it, and if it hurts, slow down. So again, I think people there's a huge variation, but I think they need to be given the confidence by people who perhaps know to try things, and most people achieve that, which is great.
I know the Games will go a long way towards just starting conversations and awareness about organ donation. What's the situation in the UK? Is there a long waiting list? Are there shortages of particular organs?
Yeah, organ shortage across the world is tough. We are middle of the road about organ donation levels. Some places like Spain have much higher levels than we do. So you can have organs from dead people, and you can have patients from live people. But in short, there are about 6,000 patients waiting on the waiting list for an organ, and we only do about 4,000 transplants a year, from about 1,500 deceased patients each year. So you can see there's a shortfall, and 1, 2, 3 patients a day will die because of not getting a transplant, waiting on the waiting list. So
that's a staggering number. I was reading it. 3 a day on average.
Yeah. So some aren't sitting on the waiting list. They've just got so ill that they're taken off the waiting list. They just become too ill to have a transplant, too ill to get through the operation. But others genuinely die on the waiting list. So improving our donor rate everywhere, but obviously we're focused on the UK, is a real issue for us.
One thing I hadn't realised, that the law has changed around organ donation, and quite recently, wasn't it, in May 2020?
Yeah.
So it's now an opt-out scenario rather than opt-in.
Yeah.
How is that translating in real terms into the success and the availability of organs?
I think that's a really good point, and 2020 has been a pretty big year for us all. Yeah. And the trouble is, because of COVID, it's hard to answer that question honestly and with any knowledge, really, because I don't think we really know the effect of the change in law, because transplant pretty much went to a standstill in March 2020. Right. So we shall see. But in essence, in the olden days, it was assumed you would not give your organs, and then part of the transplant team would ask relatives and friends, what do you think? Is it okay if this, and maybe, and we all have the ability to say whether we want what our wishes on a website, or when we apply for a driving license.
I was going to say, that was the first time I remember my attention being drawn to it, when I passed my driving test. Exactly. And you get a form that says, do you want to be an organ donor? And you can select which organs. But that's not quite
so
the case now.
It helps that our families and our friends know what our wishes are by whichever means we've used. But as I say, before March, it was all about, it was assumed you were not going to be a donor, but now it's the other way around. You are assumed that you will give your organs, and only 1 in about 100 deaths are suitable for organ donation. There are 2,000 deaths a day in this country, and only 1 in about 100 are going to be suitable for organ donation. But now it's assumed that you will give your organs. Now, your family can refuse on your behalf at any time. So everyone has to agree. But if the patient who's dead, who's dying, clearly wanted to give their organs, most families would probably go along with that.
But it's about still making that wish known, even though it's an opt-out system, it's assumed that you will give your organs. Of course, when, say, I die next week, if my family are not aware that I was happy with that, they could actually still step in and say, no, we don't want any organ to be donated.
Absolutely. I mean, the guys who deal with these desperate families in intensive care around the country are incredibly sensitive and do a wonderful job. Yeah.
And when it comes to, I guess, making that decision, should you just leave it to the doctors to decide what's suitable? And I do remember, in fact, looking at that form and having the opportunity to tick which organs you would donate and perhaps some that you wouldn't. And I'm asthmatic, and I always thought, well, no one would want my lungs, surely. Should I just be ticking yes and then just leave it up to the experts to decide?
I think that's probably quite a good idea. And it is amazing. Yes, I mean, the straight answer is, who knows? We all think we drink too much and our livers won't be any good, or things like that.
I think our liver's great, and in fact it's really not.
But in fact, you just don't know until you've had various blood tests and things. And so the answer to your question is, I think that's a good way to play. Yeah.
So how has COVID impacted you and your roles? You said that transplant operations just almost practically came to a standstill for you.
Yes, well, ITUs were being used for COVID patients back in March. There's obviously a big issue with immunocompromised patients. All these patients who have a transplant are given drugs to stop them rejecting, but that reduces their immune system, so they were more susceptible to COVID. So for lots of reasons, organ donation pretty much came to a standstill. But it did trickle along, and
are you busy again
and we're
now?
pretty much back and up and running now, yes.
So if the Transplant Games wants to encourage people to have those conversations, to make their family aware of their wishes, is there somewhere where they can go to actually register their wishes? Is it something that's done in a will, or other than just doing it verbally and making it known, is there somewhere you can actually put that down?
That's a good question. So the NHS donation website is pretty clear. It's got these big red and green boxes, so I think even I can do it, so it must be pretty straightforward. Yes.
Yeah. And I mentioned at the start that you performed the first live liver transplant for the NHS in 2007. Was it a televised operation?
Well, I was involved in the second laparoscopic kidney donation. So we did the donate from a live person but keyhole, so they went home in a couple of days. But we had the BBC there, which was probably a stupid idea at the time, but it actually went okay. But liver liver transplantation. Yeah, here we did the first NHS in Leeds it's a huge team. It's not just me, goodness me. A huge team where in 2007 from a son to his father. So that went well, and we're now the leading sort of NHS live donor liver transplant centre here.
I mean, a different sort of pressure. You're under all sorts of pressure performing operations of such magnitude, but when you've got cameras on you as well, or do you manage to forget it and block it out?
Yeah, I think you do. I think the pressure, to be honest, is doing operations on well people. Right. Surgeons are mostly doing it on people who need to be helped, whereas a donor is perfectly well.
Giles, it's been very good to speak to you. Dr. Giles Toogood, consultant surgeon at St James Hospital, and discussing organ donation. The British Transplant Games will feature a form of cricket, and that is taking place here in Leeds next year.